So we might have a few people still coming in, but we will start today's seminar on migrant smuggling and gender as sort of the overarching theme that we have been looking forward for quite a while to have Gabriela Sanchez with us today. We will discuss how facilitation of migration takes place not only in the global south but also in the global north. And this seminar is the second in a series that we run throughout the fall on gender and insecurity. We've put some flyers out there, but you can also see the entire program on our web. And apart from that, I must say, I think we are all, but I am particularly happy to host this as a physical seminar. We've had webinars for quite a while, which are also helpful. But this is a totally different experience to have living human beings sitting in our auditorium. So thank you so much for coming. That being said, I should of course tell you that we try to keep the distance, that the chairs are put in a way so that the distance should be okay. We hope that you will wash your hands or use the alcohol put out there, and if you take a water on your way out, take the one your hands are on, and don't take another one that look a bit better. You are all familiar with those rules, but I just repeat them. I should also tell you that we live stream the seminar. That means that you can see it afterwards online, but also that other people can see it. When we open for a discussion, there will be a handheld mic going around to those of you who want to pose a question or give a comment, and that will be held by the mic will be held by one of our assistants, because we don't pass around microphones during Corona. So, returning to the seminar, I mean, we often hear that migrant smuggling is dominated by transnational organized crime operating in the global south and consisting of often groups of foreign men organized into ethnic mafias, cartels, militias, and tribes. However, those of us who do field work among migrants, either in their countries of origin or along the different routes they take, we often encounter that migration facilitation is much more complicated than that, and often is a direct response to decreasing and unequal access to legal, safe, and orderly paths of migration. And many ordinary persons, including women, are involved in facilitating migration. And it is these ordinary citizens, rather than members of organized crime, that consistently are charged with smuggling, even if their crime is nothing but helping other family members or friends cross borders, sometimes to reunite. To enlighten us about the critical role that gender, race, and class play, both in shaping the ways that migrants, and both men and women, participate in smuggling for profit, but also their encounters with the criminal justice system. How that play out, we have invited Gabriela Sanchez, who is one of the leading experts on this subject. She comes from the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence, directly, arrived yesterday. And as an ethnographer interested in the everyday dynamics of irregular migration facilitation, Gabriela has conducted field work in the Americas, in North Africa, in the Middle East and Europe, on the experience and perspectives of migrants and people and the people behind their journeys. But Gabriela has also spent more than 15 years working with undocumented migrants, primarily Mexican migrants, and the people who assist them, and served in some of the court cases that were taken to the Arizona Criminal Court, right? In Florence, Gabriela has worked to increase our understanding of smuggling as part of community life and its economic impact, as well as to document the roles played by women, young people, and indigenous communities in the facilitation of mobility. In the seminar invitation, there's a link you can press if you want to see the impressive number of publications that Gabriela has written on the subject. My name is Nina Nyberg Sørensen. I'm a senior researcher at DIIS and coordinate research carried out on various aspects of international migration, security and development also. And over the next 45 minutes, Gabriela and I will have a conversation. I mean, Gabriela is the lead star. I will ask a few questions. And after that, we will open up for comments from you and joint discussion. We aim at ending no later than 4 o'clock. I will try to keep the time. And to get that going, I think we should start by getting Gabriela to tell us more about your work on the organization of human smuggling.
I turned this on. And well, first of all, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited that the room is so full, and again to see so many great people. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, Nina, for having invited me, and thank you for your interest in the session. You know, it's really exciting that we're able to see each other in a day like this, and what everything else that is happening around us. But my name is Gabriela Sanchez, and I am, as Nina already indicated, a researcher. I have a background in law enforcement. I was a criminal investigator on the US-Mexico border, responding directly to cases that were related to migrant smuggling and human trafficking for 7 years before I decided to, cross the line, going to the dark, road of academia, where I have been ever since. So it's been certainly very interesting to look not only at how the facilitation of migration takes place, but also at the very narratives that are circulated and how there is this very vast system, and that is part of the criminal justice system that facilitates this criminalization processes. So thank you so much for being here, and once again to DIIS for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you. I wonder whether you could tell us a bit more about these general images of human smuggling that are circulating out there in different international organizations and in law enforcement, and how they, according to your work, fit with what you find on the ground.
Of course, I think it's very important to start by defining, what we actually mean by migrant smuggling. Migrant smuggling is the facilitation of the entry of a person into a country different from his or her own, usually on the basis of a financial transaction. So this is what the protocol typically says. But if I ask you, each one of the persons in this room to think about smuggling, we know that those images are not neutral, that are very much charged. When I say the word smuggler, when we read the word smuggler, they are very much defined along the lines of race, of class, and gender. And almost immediately, we tend to associate them with a part of a region of the world. In the case of Europe, we typically think we immediately go to North Africa and to Libya, which has been the more visible case, if we want to call it. In the context of COVID, of course, there's other contexts or other locations that have emerged. But this is typically what we see, or the images of the boats, the drownings, or also the responses, the humanitarian responses and the criminalization of white Europeans, for their humanitarian labor, on behalf of migrants or trying to rescue people. But again, looking back or trying to unpack a little bit of the image of the smuggler, we see that it's typically a man, typically somebody who is racialized as somebody of color. In the case, once again, in the case of Europe, a black man that is hypersexual and hyperviolent, and also very much driven by greed. So this notion of smugglers generating, billions of dollars, as it's quoted often in the reports by IOM or UNODC, has been an idea that has been taken, and reproduced constantly on most of the documents, and that is very appealing in a sense, because it's also very much connected to the suffering of migrants. Here, of course, we have to recognize that migrants who travel irregularly do face immense amounts of violence on the context of the journey. So we are not denying that. But here, what I would like for all of us to think about is how there's all of these notions, again, of who the smuggler is and why we should be worried, concerned about him.
So you would say that that image do not necessarily fit with what you find on the ground?
How can I start with it? There's several people in this room whose work, you're very lucky here at this, because you also have the top scholars on the facilitation of irregular migration. And what has been really great about all of this work is that together we have been able to come up with a very solid body of scholarship that actually counters a lot of those narratives, saying like, wait, the fact that facilitation or this processes of as other scholars like yourself have called them as brokerage, have emerged, is the fact that there's no paths for safe, legal migration for people. People cannot have access, or people do not have access, not everybody rather. The access to this legal paths is not even or equal. So what we have been able to document collectively on the ground has actually challenged many times what UNODC, IOM, Interpol has said. For me, it has also been very exciting that when I first started doing this work, I think we felt very isolated, that we were finding we as researchers were probably finding some of this evidence in other locations, but the narrative was so strong that we never felt, it was like, maybe we're just imagining things. Maybe we have spent so much time on the ground with the people that we think that they are really caring about each other. But being able to come together, being able to develop these collaborations among researchers have actually shown the fact that there is care, there is protection, there are mechanisms of solidarity and support that emerge among people on the migration pathway. So that, in that sense, the power of this collective scholarship, has, I am not saying that he has created a seismic change, right, on the way we talk about migration facilitation, but it has raised some concerns about why we have to look at it more critically.
And I got to know your work on the US-Mexican border, but you've spent quite some time now in Europe. So I wonder what this switch to Europe and what's going on in Europe look like from your perspective.
Yes. God, where do we start? I think as critical, as we have been collectively about the facilitation of migration, as researchers, we have continued to look at the global south. We very much focus on what is happening in Africa, what is happening in along the U.S.-Mexico border, and other in the Middle East. So there is still that view or that perspective that we need to we're still watching what is happening there. But I also think that in part as a result of the pandemic, we are starting to look more inward, like what is happening here. If you have followed the news during this, last, 9 months already, there was a spike on the number of crossings from Tunisia to Europe. Also all of the events in Dover, the people who were crossing the English Channel, that are not new by any means of the imagination, but that are showing us what could be a potential, trend in the future, and increased levels of enforcement within Europe, and the increasing targeting of facilitation within Europe. So being able to look inward was one of the key elements of this presentation, what we really wanted to discuss, how smuggling looks like when we start looking inward, rather than just focusing on what's happening elsewhere.
Yeah. And I know that one of the ways that you have looked at it is to look at sort of what comes out of the anti-smuggling enforcement policies. And what is the picture we get from looking, say, at the legal records of who gets apprehended and convicted, for instance? That's one of the ways you recommend.
Despite the perception that nothing is happening in Europe, or that, again, smuggling is happening elsewhere, Europe is, in fact, a very active hub for, this is more of a law enforcement term, it's a very active hub for migrant smuggling. But what we know is that once people reach Europe, they don't just stay, put in one location. They start reaching out to each other. They made friends along the way, and they find ways to move. I think there's again, not if we want to complicate the picture of just organized crime being involved with it. What we see is, once again, a lot of the support and assistance that people provide to each other along the way. So that is that is one of the aspects that we need to pay attention to. However, at the same time, there is, as I was just saying earlier, this push towards by law enforcement agencies to better document what is happening within Europe. And in fact, I have a quick number right here. Europol put together a report, their 2019 report that was just published this last May, that says that 14,218 people were detained within Europe as suspects of migrant smuggling. So that is already showing, this trend of how many thousands of people are being labeled suspects. So that's one of the concerns, I guess, that we have is that, or not a concern, but this massive number of people, in a sense, matches as well the capacity or the levels of Frontex. If you look at the reports that all of this, Frontex, Europol, Interpol pulled together, they show, or they focus rather, on containing large organizations, vast networks, organizations that facilitate visa fraud. So there's very large, very complex cases that justify this level, not only their budgets, which we know are, quite large, but also this display of power, and reach. And in that sense, those official reports are very, very effective. They are already communicating the sense, again, of increased enforcement or stepped-up enforcement. But when we take a closer look at the data as well, we start to realize that there is not a lot in terms of it. So again, these agencies are providing numbers of suspects, numbers of emails that they sent out, numbers of action days that they carry out. But there's really not a lot in terms of official sources of data that tell us how many people were not suspects, but actually charged with migrant smuggling. How many of them would eventually qualify for relief? It could be, to qualify for asylum, exactly, or even, again, or we're going to get to that in a second. But if they were actually acting under the terms of the protocol that allow and that protect humanitarian facilitation of border crossings. So the question will be like, okay, so if Frontex is doing that, is there another source of data that we can look at, something that is more detailed or that will give us more detailed access to what we are dealing with? And the answer is yes. There's a database that UNODC has been putting together for several years, and it's called Sherlock, just like the detective. And Sherlock is beautiful in the sense that it is put together by people who actually submit cases that have been prosecuted in different jurisdictions. And another important aspect of this specific database, which is available to everyone, so in fact, you can, after the seminar is over, you can go and look up the cases. They are separated by gender. So this is another, by gender and location. Once we start looking and taking a closer look at who actually, the cases that are reported, the cases that are sent in, what the cases collectively say, we get a very different picture. The cases that actually are prosecuted in court or in courts across Europe hardly ever involve large organizations. There is no indication of people making a lot of money. These are primarily migrants, people who are waiting also for determinations on their asylum claims. Family members that are trying to reunite with their parents, children who are trying to reunite with their parents, or parents who are trying to bring their children from other locations. But again, when we don't look at the data that closely, or when we don't have access to that level of segregated data, in a sense, we tend to go with this larger message of organized crime and networks. It's an easier, catchier message, right, than the one that will just show us the more nuanced, the more detailed dynamics that shape the facilitation of irregular migration.
So, I mean, you have looked at that data, but you have also collected your own data. So maybe, I mean, we could talk a bit about sort of this everyday facilitation of migrant smuggling, and how the roles and activities of men and women involved differ. Perhaps also some of the community aspects of this that I know you have worked upon.
Once again, looking through these cases, there's let me back up a little. The facilitation of irregular migration is definitely gendered. We see this on the ground and on the work of multiple researchers, right? Men tend to perform certain roles, typically those that involve being outside, being outdoors, or that involve also higher levels of risk, perhaps driving long distances, carrying weapons. And in the case of women, we also see a tendency for them to remain in locations that are close to their households, or not to be as visible. This is something that I was just carrying out some interviews with law enforcement a couple of weeks ago when I asked them, like, oh, what about women? You're telling me all of this about the quote-unquote male smugglers. And everybody told me, there's no women. There's no women out there. And what this data, once again, show is this, again, this very gender division of labor. And how not only, once again, what we had been able to document in the cases of, or research on the Global South, but the prosecutions that are being carried out within Europe show that, I think I'm going to, I would start by, dividing or splitting some of the roles and, or who the people who, again, facilitate this or who are charged, rather, with migrant smuggling are. They are most of the time they are, once again, the mothers of children who were left behind. So mothers who are trying to bring their children to Europe. People who are many times women who are carrying false passports to enter Europe. What would be, self-smuggling, if you want to call it of some sort. There's as well the there is a level of for-profit smuggling as well. When people actually profit, earn money, by virtue of bringing in, not only by facilitating the entrance or the entering of somebody into a different country, but allowing for the stay of that person within Europe once he or she has entered the country. And a third category that is very prevalent actually in this data from UNODC is the cases that have been filed against spouses who have housed their own spouses, as troubling as that sounds. And again, we see a very clear division, who gets charged along the lines of gender. Once again, women are more likely to be charged with smuggling their own children. Women are more likely to be, again, held liable criminally for housing their spouses, who tend to be irregular migrants. And surprisingly, most of these cases have actually been in France. Cases of women who, for example, marry other migrants for the payment of a fee tend to involve women from Eastern Europe. And this is all, once again, available, pretty much in the database. When it comes to, I don't think I have talked much about men. Have I?
Please, go ahead.
So I better talk about men. In the case of men, once again, what we see is, well, I spoke a little bit about this involvement in riskier activities, but also men tend to be involved in larger groups. By virtue of being involved in the facilitation with these larger groups, they also generate a little bit more of income. Women make very little or generate very little returns when it comes to their involvement in the facilitation of irregular migration. One explanation that could be seen by that is not only what we already know in terms of the gap, how women are likely to make less, but precisely because of what I had mentioned earlier, this level of invisibility, how their roles that they perform are seen as irrelevant, as really unimportant, so they can just get whatever is left compared to the amounts of money that may be generated by men. So those are, just some general observations that we see, once again, when we use a different kind of lens. Something that is common to most of the people who are convicted is their financial precarity. So once again, when you go through the case law and the case files, you will see that most of them were facing evictions, illness, that have very large debt. As a very quick example, the case in Essex, back last year, the driver was somebody who owed, I think he had just started a family, owed a significant amount of money. So there's never, we are not talking once again about wealthy people becoming involved. We are looking at people who are financially in situations of financial precarity, and who are just trying to make an additional amount of income to try to reduce those that level of inequality, that level of precarity that they are facing.
Just to make sure that I understand you correctly.
I know it's a lot. I'm sorry.
So you are saying, well, these images of very well organized criminal networks, sort of with arms all over the place, and who sort of unscrupulously kill and mistreat migrants. They are out there, probably also, but that the number of cases of those who get apprehended, these are the small fish that are really of a different kind. So that's what you're saying.
I'm in fact a little, I think there's several times when I said I don't want to refer to them as little fish necessarily, because I think that really creates this hierarchies over, who is more powerful or who is less powerful. When what I'm actually, we are working together at several of us on a piece that shows that what we're witnessing is the increase in the flattening of who participates in migrant smuggling. It is, we're not saying, or we're not suggesting that there is exploitation or that there is abuse. There exists, and I think we have collectively, and also international bodies have collected very good information that details this level of abuse and intimidation. What we question is, once again, how these images are used across all the people who are being prosecuted or charged. It's a size-fits-all, with one size fits all kind of model that really does not match what we see on the ground. So, but it is, law enforcement has typically relied on this notion as like, well, you know, we're only getting to the small fish. And here the question is like, well, isn't it that everybody's a small fish? Rather than, you know, just looking for networks or looking for organizations or looking for, you know, like all of this vast amounts of money that are being allegedly being generated.
So delving a bit about the money, and perhaps also the violence that are sort of twin images very often in both in the literature, but also especially maybe in the press coverage. Are the profits as high as we often hear, or who earns the big money in the business, and how is violence involved in that?
One of our researchers documented a case. You know, he was interviewing a smuggling facilitator and asked him, like, how, you know, you're charging thousands of dollars to every person, you know, to make it from here to a specific destination. And the guy, the facilitator, you know, grabbed a stick and drew a circle. And he said, you know, like maybe he marked like a small portion of it, like, this is what we make. He said, everything else, you know, we spend on bribes. So there's, of course, the element of corruption that takes place globally, and that is really not very much discussed in international reports or in law enforcement reports. The other aspect is that many times the fees that we hear, you know, associated with journeys, you know, when you hear, oh, this person paid $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, you know, to get to one point to another, it's actually an aggregation or a calculation of what a person spent over 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And it's what, you know, to that person sounds, you know, when he or she starts trying to think like, well, you know, I borrowed so much from so-and-so, or I owe my mother and I haven't paid her, you know, so much more money. Or, you know, my neighbor told me, you know, I was able to get this much wired. So many times these numbers, you know, are not very much reflective of it. They were not paid as a, you know, lump sum. People don't travel that way. Or when somebody, you know, you probably heard how people say, well, you know, if he could pay $10,000 for a smuggler, how come he cannot pay for a visa? And it's, once again, people don't travel that way. Oh, it's back. What we see is that people travel on a kind of pay-as-you-go basis. So they go as far as their money takes them. So, and that means that those smaller fees stay with the facilitator or the person that provides that specific segment. So perhaps in 1 month, you know, a facilitator got very lucky, and everybody was going through that route, or he or she just got a lot of clients going through. But maybe the next month, the border gets closed, COVID hits, the facilitator himself, you know, gets sick, her mother gets sick, so he or she cannot work. So money doesn't come in at the same level every time, every month, or, you know, always. And those are, again, nuances that only come from us taking a closer look at the data. And not just assuming that, you know, these large amounts that get quoted all the time represent what is actually happening on the ground.
And what you say is that a lot of that money end up as bribes to law enforcement.
Correct. And there's also another aspect that, you know, is very much gendered. What we have seen is that the earnings that women generate are almost, not only women, but mostly women, are immediately recirculated to cover emergency needs. You know, food, housing, around the time school starts, for supplies for their children. A lot of the money that men generate is actually wired back to their communities, to their families back home. So this, again, this kind of funding goes back to the same communities where that migrants left or that migrants are transiting through. Really quick, because we could spend the entire afternoon talking about violence. The forms that we see, the forms of violence that we get to see in migrant smuggling facilitation are also quite specific. And I think most of us are familiar with them. We tend to hear a lot about kidnappings, extortion, and again, I'm critical of this. I would call it obsession with sexual violence. I call it obsession because many times it's again seen or described as only afflicting women, when men are the target of sexual violence, very much on the migration trail. So that's what we also have to bring in. Take a closer look at how violence operates. And in the case of kidnappings, there is really not a lot of consensus on what a kidnapping is. Many times, families are practically negotiating fees and migrants for their relatives to continue with the journey. So we cannot talk about kidnappings, or that all situations involving a migrant staying at a specific place will count as a kidnapping. What we do know in terms of violence is, again, that is very specific in terms of, again, the kinds of crimes that take place, and that it is not generalized. Not everybody is going to find the same kind of violence. And that many times the amount that you pay, the amount that you're able to cover for your fee, is also going to provide you with a level of protection. So again, we need to take a closer look at how we understand violence and how we think about it in terms of, along the lines of gender.
Yeah, you mentioned in passing that the COVID-19 pandemic had influenced this market tremendously. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that?
Of course. If you look at the reports from law enforcement, almost everybody says that demand is going up, prices are going up, like they have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. And when you ask for the evidence, they say, well, I heard that. Or somebody told me, like, have you been to the field? No, because of COVID. And this, once we start asking more questions, what we tend to see is that the demand has actually decreased because borders are closed. There's a group of people who are still going to try to migrate. That is for sure. And there's still going to be smuggling facilitators who are going to be there to facilitate that journey. But there is going to be even more negotiation when it comes to pricing right now, because migrants themselves are not going to have enough access to the resources that would allow them to move. Many times families are the ones that are sending the fees or the money from abroad so that they can pay for their fees. So families themselves, are concerned, like, do I really want to invest in bringing my relative or paying for my relative's fee right now when I don't have a job, or my children need a computer so that they can, do their schoolwork. So there's other decisions that are coming into play. As we see the restrictions that are related to COVID being reduced or eliminated, it's very likely that we're going to see an initial spike. But at the same time, people have been put for so long that many of them have either gone back to their countries of origin, what we were talking about right before the seminar. Many of them have moved to other cities looking for other kinds of opportunities. So it's not like everybody's just at the border waiting to cross. But that is, again, a very strong image that many law enforcement bodies are putting out there, because that, again, justifies a lot of the enforcement that we're likely to see in the months to come.
So what you're saying is, in reality, that maybe we are targeting poor people more than organized crime?
Smuggling is a crime of the poor and for the poor. And those images of organized crime are facilitating the way in which we punish the poor. So we have to be, this is why it's also very important that we take a closer look at the data, and that we also hold institutions accountable for what they are doing. So there is, again, I am not saying that all smuggling facilitators operate the same way, or that all of them have the same complexity. But we're seeing, what I'm trying to say here once again is that we need to take a closer look at how diverse they can be, and the kinds of implications that prosecuting them or going after them will have on the people on the ground.
Yeah. I was reading through this new pact just a few days ago, and looking at what is it that the European Union says in terms of revising our system. And it says that it wants to address the root causes of irregular migration. It wants to combat migrant smuggling. It wishes to help refugees reside in third countries, that is not ours. And it wish to support well-managed legal migration. I was struck, and not only in this pact, but in many recent writings from international organizations and also researchers, I was struck by the phrase irregular migration being used to denominate anything in between, say, a young guy wanting to live the sweet life in Europe and an asylum seeker. So what it made me think is, I mean, in the area of human trafficking, countries get their ranking in the so-called TIP reports from showing a fall in numbers of trafficked persons and an implementation of a legal framework in country X, always in the global south, and the rise in number of convictions in that country in the global south. Do you think that sort of this new pact is a way of developing a similar system with regards to human smuggling, where sort of our partner countries, European partner countries, can be looked upon and be gifted according to how well they respond to that?
I think we're already witnessing that, on how this vast amount of resources, were sent out to contain irregular migration, or to set up projects or programs, or development initiatives, as they're called many times, to contain the, if we want to call it, the spread of irregular migration. It's at the same time very concerning that there's no mechanism to account for any of the resources that are being dedicated to any of these measures. We don't know how effective they are. We don't, and there is really no clear effort with anybody to follow or to trace, to follow the money in this sense. At the same time, many of these countries, these third countries, are becoming, are having to adapt their own narratives to all of the demands that are coming from Europe. And not only from Europe, but also by, from other bodies. Still the United States has a very strong, presence across Africa. The State Department, that is at the end, very much related to the TIP report. What we're also seeing is this spread of trainings, and on how to better manage the border and how to contain irregular migration, how police bodies, border agents are being trained on the ground, on how to better respond. So there's just the same way we have seen, or we have spoken about the extraterritorialization of borders. We see this spread of training and education, that aims at creating a uniform perception of what smuggling is about. So it's going to be very interesting to see what emerges. At the same time, I think what we see in trafficking is that something very similar as we see in smuggling. When you actually look at the numbers of prosecution for human trafficking are very, very low, and the numbers of victims are even lower. So I also think that there's some concern on the part of governments worldwide that taking a closer look at their data would reveal that despite the if we want to call them the success at apprehending or detaining irregular migrants that are, again, as you said, everybody's an irregular migrant. What those numbers are going to reveal is, again, the widespread apprehension of migrants rather than smugglers. And legal systems around the world are really not even set up to prosecute migrant smuggling. So the way they are in many countries, to prosecute human trafficking. So it will be very interesting to see, what the process is there. But I think again that the push towards training, education, and enforcement, points at a specific formalization or standardization of practices.
Yeah. We will shortly have to end our conversation. I just have one last question before we open up. Me and my colleagues here at DIIS, and also some colleagues that I have elsewhere, we often talk about how the data we generate for the moment being are not very popular among policymakers. And I reckon that what you have just related on human smuggling globally, but especially in the context of Europe, is not very popular when we are going to discuss how to bring forward this new European Pact on migration. So if I was to ask, how do we then, as researchers, get into dialogue with our policymakers on these issues? Would you have any ideas? It would be okay to say no, because I don't have any.
I think for us collectively, the work that we have been able to do for several years, when several of us came together to start doing the work on smuggling, we really never thought that there was going to be a space for, to bring up this more critical stakes or stances. For those of us who have worked together in publications, working together has been very useful. And there's also people within the organizations, within, among policymakers, that are also very open to this new, more critical and more evidence-based stances. And the case of the work that we have been carrying out over the last few years, that you can see a lot of that collective work being cited. Because there is a real interest on trying to understand, well, if this so-called business model is really not what we think it is, then what is it? So I think being able to reach out and to build these collaborations, among scholars, and also to bring on board this work of more junior scholars and also scholars from the Global South is critical, at creating this kind of like mass movement, if you want to call it, and having evidence that is strong enough to be brought into the conversations.
That sounds like a very great idea that we should start pursuing as from now. And I know that you are already out there. So thank you very much, Gabriela, for introducing the subject of gender and insecurity through the lens of human smuggling and gendered human smuggling. I would now like to invite all of you who might wish to comment, come with a different opinion, ask a question, anything goes, and I will try to steer who wants to speak. So raise your hand. I have a hand here. Ida Marie Wammen. And I will ask you to say your name.
Yeah, I'm Ida Marie Wammen. I work here as a postdoc at DIIS. And thank you so much for this presentation, Gabriela. It was really wonderful. And I just have two questions. One is, like, you have observed basically the smuggling industry. I don't know if we can even call it an industry after your talk today, for quite some years now. But how do you see, for example, increasing externalization efforts? How does that impact the smuggling system? And here right now I sit with interviews, migrants describing their journeys to Europe. And actually, the violence they encounter are much more with local authorities than with smugglers. So I also think, how are these things interlinked? So externalization efforts and maybe also smugglers' collaboration with local authorities. And the second question is basically basically if you can say a bit more about trust between the migrant and the smuggler, and also if you see some gender differences there.
Oh, okay. Is
Thank
it
you.
related or something different?
My first question was actually one that Ida just posed. I
Should we
wanted
take it over?
to. My name is Lena Richter. I'm from the Department of Anthropology, and I also work on migrant smuggling. And I was very happy to hear your presentation. But I also wanted to ask a bit more about what happens now during the COVID era, or whatever we call it. Kind of related to what you're talking about, because in my experience, migrants are talking about even more kind of draconian measures throughout their journeys from states, from authorities, maybe under the guise of COVID, maybe not. So a little bit interrelated to this. So the meeting with different authorities, also to decenter some of the conversation a bit from these everybody's going to Europe, for instance. I know you also worked in North Africa, where a lot of migrants travel to as destinations or whatever we call them, and I'm sure that's also happens in other regions. Not everyone is going to the US, right? So also decentering that a little bit by talking about what happens actually meeting these authorities.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, too for the great questions. Libby, could talk about this for this is, I think, something that definitely didn't touch upon, but we are so focused on the forms of violence that migrants experience at the hands of the smugglers, that migrants experience at the hands of smugglers, that we don't see that there's many other actors that they encounter. And in fact, what I have also seen, and I'm sure that you both have seen in your work, is just the everyday violence that they experience at the hands of ordinary people. And how levels of discrimination, of theft, just physical assaults. When it comes to local authorities, we also have to think, and this has been primarily the work that we have been doing in North Africa, the very vulnerability of also those at the local level that all of those border actors experience. So these are people who are also many times part of those same communities with very low salaries, far away from large cities, in posts that are out in the middle of nowhere. So being able to generate a bit of extra income, by that as through violence or extortion or just threats. You don't really need to escalate something up to violence. When you were told, like, well, you can either pay me, $5 or €5, or you're not going to go through here. Just that alone is threat enough for you to try to follow through with that. So I think that we also have to see, if we take a closer look also at violence, how physically violent these encounters can also be. In fact, most of what most of us have documented in terms of the extortion, the physical violence occurs in these local spaces, and how people go from one to the next. So trying to understand more of those local dynamics of violence, how they operate by people who are pretty much alike, because many times as well what we see here is that migrants that become stranded are the ones that are also exercising the violence on other migrants. So again, it is more complex than just saying that, or labeling, all forms of violence the same way. Let's see. And we can, if I'm missing anything, please let me know. But it is also very important, and thank you for bringing it up, this notion of, we just think that everybody wants to come to Europe, or that everybody wants to come to the US. That's their main aspiration, right? When we were able to interview people who had traveled through Libya, and several other researchers have documented the fact that people were perfectly fine in Libya. And by this, I'm not saying that it was, the conditions were great or anything like that, but they had reached a level of stability that they had not in their countries, that they lacked in their countries of origin. And it was, of course, not perfect, but they were able to navigate the conflict because the conditions many times in their countries had been worse. And many of the interviews that we carried out for that specific project showed that it was, in fact, the conflict that was that developed, through although the political intervention. I think that's the easiest way of calling it. The role of the EU and especially of Italy eventually made the conditions so unbearable for them that they decided to leave. But when you ask them, like, where were you going? Like, I just wanted out of Libya. But there was never like, oh, I have this vision that I wanted to go to Europe. That is how we imagine the journeys of other people. I often tell people, think about your own journey. Did you ever think that you were going to end up where you are? And that's when they, oh no, I just left because I got a scholarship or I got a job. So I think the same way we think about our our own journeys is something that we have to that will apply to the experiences of others in that sense.
Other comments or questions?
Maybe my trust question.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. See, I have all of them here. Trust. Oh God, trust. Where do I start with trust? I think trust goes both ways. It's not only, many times we have probably heard stories of how migrants say, and this is the most often cited, I trusted the smuggler and the smuggler took off with all my money, and he took advantage of me, I don't have any more, that was it. And then when you speak with the facilitators, you start hearing that expletive, run away without paying his fee, like never delivered on what he was supposed to do, or he or she. People go into this into this exchanges or this agreements rather that emerge along the migration pathway, having to trust many times blindly each other. So nobody's going to have. And in fact, our own relationships, we're not completely sure that the other person is going to behave the way we are, we expect them to. So here, of course, we have to add all the layers of the vulnerabilities along the way, the fact that people are traveling, across vast distances, and again, in the context of incredible levels of militarization and enforcement. But it is not always, once again, this focus on the smuggler, the one that we have to use as the measure of analysis. But once again, there's relationships that emerge and that are forged along the way. And again, happy to talk about trust.
I see a very quiet audience, even though I see several experts now. I see a hand. Robin May Schott, please.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I'm not a migration researcher, but I am U.S. in background, and so I was fascinated to hear you talk about your own entry working as a what was it? Police. What's the formal use of that? And the U.S.-Mexican border. So, as an American, of course, we're very aware of the constant public image of crisis around that border. I'm very curious, everything you've now said about local context, flat as opposed to hierarchical, what would you say to your former self with those insights? How would you then intervene into that debate about migration in the U.S.?
The current debate?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's a tough one.
That's I'll go like students. Could you repeat the question? I'll tell you, I never thought that I was going to start to study smuggling and the migration facilitation ever. I was perfectly fine carrying out investigations on the border. And I had a wonderful boyfriend at the time, and I thought that I was going to do that, for the rest of my life in Arizona. I mean, other than the summertime, it's a great place to live. But I was always very bothered by the fact that my community and the place that I called home was being represented the way it was, and that I was, as part of my job as a criminal investigator, I was facilitating myself the criminalization of my community. I was allowing, for I still remember first, single mothers, gardeners, cooks, construction workers to go to prison for housing people, driving them across the border, giving them water, and especially their experiences not receiving the same attention of those of people who were being labeled as the true heroes or the true humanitarians by virtue of or working for humanitarian organizations or even or the church, local churches. I was glad that I left law enforcement. I never thought that the experience from the, at that time I never had the experience from the U.S.-Mexico border was going to be so common to the experiences of so many people and along so many borders. And I think that already shows, again, also, it's also very telling of the work that other researchers are doing on how, once we start looking at how the people that we grow with, the people who welcome us into their homes, the people that, as students, guide us as we do the research, what is also our commitment to them? Yes, it's all about. So, I guess it's a long way of saying, for me, making that decision was, I didn't see it at that time, but it was engaging critically with everything that I was seeing, because I realized that I was what I was doing within my community was central to, became central to the work that I do. And when I work with or junior researchers, I tell them that, think what your research is doing for your community, and how your community is being represented. The debate right now, I was just talking about another researcher last week, said that regardless of who wins the election, we're going to be asked about the wall again. We're like, the wall. When for us, the wall has been there for decades. So the wall is not the issue. The wall has never been the issue for us, despite the fact that everybody brings it up. It has been, once again, about what that has done to our community. So thinking, again, beyond the symbolisms, beyond the rhetoric, has been, I think it would be, that's what I would keep telling myself, slapping myself, or slap the Gabriela from 15 years ago. Like, don't look at that, don't look at the wall. Look at what your work is doing, and the likely implications of your work on the lives of others. That's a very philosophical question.
But if the wall is not the issue, then I guess the border is the issue. Thinking about gender and insecurity and Mexican industrialization, Ciudad Juárez, that kind of maquila industry catering for mostly women workers, so close to a border, and then the violence that generated. And I know it's not directly related, but I think the border perhaps is very much the issue in terms of gender violence, insecurity, more than.
I think it's also the way borders are. Rather, I think it's the way borders are operationalized, how they are transformed, how over time they have become these mechanisms of separation. Because for me, growing up along the border, crossing the border, was very different from the experiences of people who were more senior, or even younger people now. Right now, you cannot enter the United States if you're not a citizen or a permanent resident because of COVID. So even though your family is on the other side of the border, so that experience is not. That's why I think it's more about the way that the border keeps being shaped and operationalized, and because the border for a lot of us who live there, who are from there, the border is also about community. It's about life, and why we reject so often a lot of these images that want to reduce it to crime and violence and or Juarez, exactly. I lived in El Paso, which is literally right across the street. To the feminicides, when there's an even more complex context, going on.
Which is about inequality.
Very much, and how it is experienced on both sides, and very unequally once again on both of them.
Yeah. So the issue is that gender is a perfect lens to look at inequality and the production of inequality.
It does provide, with a very, it has to be essential in any kind of analysis.
Yeah. Sorry for taking the word.
Sorry.
Microphone. Or secondly.
I just wanted to return to this gender because something actually surprised me a little bit with what you said with all this data you got from the Sherlock database. It was really, really interesting, and how I think maybe I had thought that women would be charged less often than men for some reason, in terms of just what we know from criminology and criminal statistics in general, because there is also a gender bias in criminal investigations, etc. So I was actually surprised with what you say, and maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but maybe you can tell us a bit more about that.
There's a specific offenses that they are charged with. For example, the ones that I flagged most often were precisely these cases of women who were, by the way, most of the people who are charged with smuggling in Europe are European. So that's the part. But
one.
So one of the fact that they were, they were all of these cases that were specifically from France of women who were being charged because they were housing their husbands. There was not a single man that had been charged with that. And it could be, an issue of sampling, the number of cases that had been submitted, but that to me was very telling. Men were were less likely, once again, to be found smuggling their own children. And that's that's most of the cases in the database also pointed to that. So that's one. So that is specifically to that data. When looking at the data from the U.S.-Mexico border, for example, what we see is that a lot of many times people were not even, and this, although this is global, I was able to document this on data on the U.S.-Mexico border. Many times, women are not charged with smuggling. They are charged with committing fraud, the use of electronic equipment. That's because they caught them on the cell phone, just sending messages to each other. So that takes them out from all of the statistics that would count or account for people charged with smuggling. And so that way, they become once again invisible. And that's so we don't really know what happens there. And usually there's what was actually very troubling in the Sherlock data were several statements from judges themselves saying that they were imposing stiffer sentences on women for being women. There was one case in specific, when I was going through the data, that said that the judge wrote right there in the decision that he was assigning this woman harsher sentence because she had committed the offense when she was pregnant. So that case eventually got appealed, and her sentence got reduced but not eliminated, and she was still convicted. So these are, some of those disparities that we get to see along the, in the cases. But again, that can only become visible if we take a closer look at how the differences between how men and women are convicted.
Olivia, the gentleman in the middle there.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. My name is Ala Kassab. I'm an investigative journalist. We were lucky to try to portray some of the human smugglers in 2017 with the film Human Smugglers, together with the Danish radio, the Danish podcast. And a lot of observations, like you mentioned, we have still this secret word that we don't know all the details, how it shifts from one stage to another, and sometimes the shift from smuggling to trafficking, for example, North Africa or Libya. We were in a mission in the Mediterranean where we met many Africans who described the Libyan guards that they actually took their belongings and their money and forced them to go for the trip to Italy, which was Libya for them, a good destination. While on the other hand, you find thousands of people who are willing themselves to go and find smugglers to help them reaching their destination. So, like, you have also high demand smugglers they face in different areas, from Turkey to the north of Europe, where they have to pay high amount of money and also take a high risk. So the smugglers, we cannot always say they are ruthless, because they have other smugglers. For people, they are actually the ones who help them make their dreams come true. And yeah, my question, instead of only just giving another presentation like yours.
You're welcome.
No, I think she did enough. I just wanted to summarize this with one question. How serious do you see politically from the governments like Europe and United States? How serious you see the efforts to really look at the root causes that you mentioned behind these waves of immigrants trying to reach some destinations, sometimes taking high risks, while we see it more sometimes it's a dramatic failure for the politicians trying sometimes to put all the blame on the human smugglers and making a lot of efforts. Sofia in the Mediterranean, training coast guards, Libyan coast guard, how to push people back, how to bring all the army or the big navies to stand in the Aegean Sea to stop the small rubber boats to go back to Turkey. How much is that serious in terms of really looking at the catastrophe behind people taking this risk, instead of putting all the claims over and over on the human smugglers, that it seems to be kind of impossible to put track on them, find them in one place and stop them? Because over the history until now, we see human smugglers always one step ahead.
Simple answer, there's no political interest and no political will.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe you can qualify?
No. We didn't have human smugglers until 20 years ago. If you ask any, if you have relatives who migrated, or or you have friends who are migrants, they talk about this facilitation and care and provision of assistance. They have spoken about it for decades. The image, the persona of the migrant smuggler was only established with the protocol. Before that, we had, just ask anybody, we'll tell you all of these names, and they were friends, family members, relatives, So, but
what about recruiters? I mean, isn't there a
course.
long history of bad recruiters?
Yeah, because that was also, but even then, the legal term, the legal conception of the smuggler did not exist until the protocol was signed 20 years ago. So there is, in historically, that has actually been another form of violence, and especially in the case of within Africa, how suddenly there is this ahistorical way, that the complete wiping out of the history of mobility and facilitation of transits across the, throughout the continent, but labeling it, smuggling. When people have relied on this on process of facilitation for generations. But it's more effective to just come up with all of these terms, the waves of people, or like all of these words that are evocative of water, of floodings, and again, rhetoric is very effective at communicating all of this fear. But this has been part of the stories of our families for generations. It's just become more effective to label them as a smuggling, for political purposes. But again, there is no political interest, to eradicate, not only to eradicate. There is no political interest in creating safe paths for mobility. That's it. And we can talk about this, again, forever. So.
Have I missed some waving hands? If not, I have another question from Ida Marie Wammen and another one from Robin in that row.
No, I'm just interested in, because in our border work project we have here at DIIS, my colleague Hans have looked at also the smugglers in Niger, and he also sees how EU externalization efforts impact that people also start to choose to smuggle other goods, basically. So people are too complicated. So it's drugs and birds, apparently, right now,
Yes.
that is trending. And
Parrots.
I think this is interesting also, if we say smuggling is also about care and social relations. Could the extreme forms of violence we see right now actually also break down the smuggling system? Would they continue to smuggle human beings, or because there's also care, like if they can't really care because they know it will be so violent? Of course there will, I think, still be groups that want to make profit, but could the extreme forms of violence we see also impact the smuggling of humans
as preventive?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. What I've heard from a lot of the facilitators themselves is that they leave the market, if you want to call it, or they stop providing services because what they see is because they see a lot of violence, because they see that people no longer care, and that is not what they want to do anymore. So what happens at that, and this has been the case actually on the U.S.-Mexico border, when the more experienced facilitators leave, that creates space for the less skilled, the less well-trained, and the ones that have the lesser amounts of social capital to go in. And it's not that they are going to be meaner or more violent, but they really don't have the experience, the collective experience and the knowledge, to protect the people. It's funny that you say, what is trending in terms of smuggling, because that's another thing. I think when there was an article that I wrote a few years ago when I said, no, there's really all of these claims that all sorts of smuggling come together is, like we need to take a closer look and examine it. And I think now the more I see it, again, as more nuanced. Can there be forms of smuggling that travel together? And we see that. We see this level, again, of collaboration, of interactions that we have written about in the past. But I think, once again, that all of these restrictions that we are very likely to see because of COVID, that are being used as an excuse to justify even more enforcement, are going to start giving rise to some of those different forms of smuggling to come together. Some of the interviews in Central America that I was doing, a couple of weeks ago, they were talking about smuggling chemicals for extractive industries, for gold, that, and which I had never heard about. Or another one that I thought was very also critical, medication. Smuggling of medication, because there was no medication. So I think that is another path that we can start looking at. What new forms of smuggling are going to emerge from all of these new restrictions?
Robin.
returning to public perceptions, which is where you started your discussion. You know, we think of smuggling in this way. We think of these stereotypes or myths, but the reality is quite different. In public perceptions, for example, returning to the U.S.-Mexican border case, where it comes to the public is in the case of family tragedies, the terrible cases when parents and children are separated, and also in Europe, the drownings of, small children. So you get this morally charged debate. And I'm curious in terms of what you were saying about what researchers can contribute to input to policy. How do you see the role of such morally charged debates? Are they useful in energizing a public will, or do they themselves also trade on, stereotypes of innocence and guilt, which is really dangerous for a research analysis?
I think you have answered, in part that question. I think we have to be very careful of how, as scholars, we are reproducing many of these messages of, deservingness, who deserves protection and who merits protection. All of these narratives of, if they went through so much suffering, shouldn't we just let them in? Or that create, again, this illusion of the perfect migrant who will be the perfect victim, that we really want to welcome. That is, for example, I've been very critical along the U.S.-Mexico border, this fixation with violence and the specific forms of violence on the border. That, again, just replicate this perception that Mexico is this, horrendous place that everybody is desperate to leave. When we know that people's decision to leave is not just because of the violence. If they was the violence alone, we've had significantly, larger numbers of people migrated. Most people stay in their countries of origin. Most people never leave. But again, it's these notions of that are only based on representations of violence are actually very counterproductive to being able to communicate a clear message.
Now, in case somebody out there is sitting with a tiny little question, now is the time.
Hi, Gabriela, it's Adrian. Everybody else, I'm Adrian, and I'm a social anthropologist. And I'm curious about this notion of female invisibility. I think it's actually quite intriguing, this idea. And I'm wondering what kind of power female invisibility affords these people. And maybe more broadly, what notions of gender afford certain kinds of spaces for maneuvering. We see men as violent and women as, caring or something. But do these notions sort of facilitate other ways of negotiating this space because we have biased or sort of general ideas about who people are because of their gender?
Yes, thank you. That's a super important question because it's also very important not to essentialize, right? Like, oh, well, women are wonderful and they are caring and loving, and that's what they care for children. Or I've actually found more cases of men caring for children than women. Or what we were saying earlier, right? That in terms of sexual violence, I was able to document more cases of men being sexually assaulted than women, for example. So in one of the complaints that law enforcement often have is these women get away with everything. And this is, and also male facilitators say that. But I think that for many women, they also see it as a mechanism of power. How, law enforcement is not going to be suspicious of me, on the one hand. At the community level, because I didn't go too much into that, women and men build these reputations along of how protective they can be, how much care they can provide for the people who travel with them, and again, it goes both ways. So, and I think that this is, in a sense, like you all mentioned, many of these charges already very revealing all of these biases. Or the way they are constructed, like a lot of the prosecutions, and there was, for example, one case of, really quick, it was a woman from Eastern Europe. They she was reported. She was part of one of these false marriages. I just forgot how they call them. When you marry somebody, scam. Well, when you pretend to marry somebody, just forgot how they are called. Scam marriages. Well, one of those.
Business marriages.
And she was marrying, it was a woman from Eastern Europe who was marrying a Nigerian man. And the person who reported her was this woman from London who thought that it was abnormal that a white woman and a black man, could, and that wasn't the actual, form. So this is, and when you look at and of course the narrative of the court was this woman was it was part of a transnational network exploiting Nigerian men. The woman had been promised £2,000 for going into the marriage. She was only paid 200, and she was using the money to avoid being evicted. So at the end, she didn't get the money. She was evicted and she was convicted. So there's again that's another series of examples on why we have to bring in again not only essentializing gender, but again just bringing in all of these other variables that can allow us to provide a more detailed analysis. Thanks for the question. It's great.
Well, thank you, everybody. But before thanking you, Gabriela, I want to say that such a great seminar series would not have been possible without my colleague, Robin. The help of our conference department, who have helped us out organizing this seminar series. Vanessa and Emma and Olivia, who has made it possible to meet and hold microphones. So thank you for that. Thank you to you, Gabriela, for this afternoon. We look so much forward to continue collaborating with you. But thank you for this afternoon for now. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Yay.